Today, we're talking about the new X-Men 97 series and its big season finale, Tolerance is Extinction. A great return, a great example of how to reboot something, and perhaps a sign for future animated projects that could return. Now, for those who don't know, X-Men became wildly popular in the 1990s as one of several of the Marvel cartoons that were out at the time. This included X-Men, Spider-Man, and others, and was kind of the closest thing we had to a Marvel Cinematic Universe back in the day, with them sometimes even overlapping. These cartoons were a lot more serialized than even other action-adventure cartoons that surrounded them, following the pattern of comic books with multi-part episodes very frequently in stories that carried across the seasons. The show was cancelled in 1997 without any real conclusion. Flash forward to a few weeks ago, and X-Men 97 came out, the implication being that this story takes place right where the 1992 story left off after 5 seasons. Something that managed to happen thanks to Disney Plus, which the show now airs on. The X-Men cartoon was pretty popular getting to that 5-season point in the 90s, but for people like me, it was a bit hard to keep up with. I was actually born in 1992 myself, making me 32 this July, and by the time I was 5, the show was already ending. I still saw it everywhere in the years that followed, as the show kept airing reruns of course, and I remember having X-Men toys, lots of X-Men trading cards, and spending many afternoons with my best friend playing the X-Men Cartoon Maker on his PC. The X-Men were just inherently cooler than a lot of other superhero setups that were out there, having a more gritty edge because the X-Men, unlike a lot of heroes in the Marvel Universe, were treated as inferior because they were mutants. Even with his recurring side characters, Spider-Man was ultimately about just one hero, but X-Men offered a world where tons of different heroes were existing all at the same time, giving you not just one team to follow even, but constant new heroes and villains being thrown into the mix from all over the world. It was a world you could imagine yourself in with your own unique identity and powers, instead of having to model yourself after one of the few limited heroes of other superhero teams and their very specific origin stories. It was an entire world to proxy into the way the Marvel Cinematic Universe is as a whole today, focusing on its ability to cross over more than anything else. That made the show a bit hard to follow on a weekly schedule, however, and a lot of people, even in that time, didn't really see the show as a full piece, just episodes here and there. When the show made its way onto Disney Plus, a lot of people were drawn to it. Not just people who were actively what we'd think of as its fandom back in the 90s, but people who had only seen bits and pieces and had become curious about it over the years. It was the kind of rewatch that happened a lot when streaming first became a thing, when classic shows that had never been properly organized could suddenly be seen in one go, commercial-free, like the world's longest movie. The numbers that the old X-Men series was getting were the kind of numbers that they wanted for new shows, and with no real investment in a product as it was already made back in the 90s, it meant there was more money to be made by making a follow-up. X-Men 97 was thus produced to continue the series, with all of the characters returning in new stories that still relied heavily on the continuity of the seasons from the original. From the get-go, this was apparently intended to be not some single limited series to wrap it all up, but a multi-season return to the show essentially in its original form. It of course has a massively different approach to animation, maintaining a style that reminds you of the original, but being more expertly produced with digital technology. The story continues where it left off, but with an adult audience in mind, they can go to more intense places. And while the original series did also have multi-part episodes, the new show focuses a lot more on that modern streaming style, with there being a more distinct arc across the season than in the original series. The key to the original series was the character Jubilee, who in the first episode is introduced as an outsider that gets taken in by the X-Men. Because Jubilee was new to the X-Men and their dynamic, we got to see the world through her fresh eyes, not from the perspective of Professor Xavier, who's been involved with the conflict since the very beginning, or Wolverine, who's been around long enough as well, but rather a fresh young kid that the audience could see themselves as. In the new series, Roberto fills that role. After 5 years on the team, Jubilee is now one of the regulars, and Roberto allows new audience members who haven't seen the show to get quick explanations on a lot of history, because the show does rely on that history very heavily. One of the key points of the X-Men is that they are led by Charles Xavier, but in the series finale of the original 90s cartoon, Xavier had to be rushed off to his space girlfriend's home because he was dying on Earth. That loss of Charles Xavier, their leader, made the entire team shift around uncomfortably, allowing for a stark contrast in the character interactions from the more muted 90s series. Each character is experiencing a different kind of freedom this season, not just mourning the loss of their leader, but also leading themselves in new ways without him. The series isn't afraid to call back to dramatic moments from the original either, with Jean Grey getting into a weird cloning subplot and not being sure which version of her had experienced those events, such as the Dark Phoenix. Now, we live in a time of weird revivals, but in my opinion, this series ultimately does the best job I can imagine for this sort of thing. There is this desire to create sequels that feel so distant and unrelated to the original, but this show definitely does what revivals of properties should do more often: build off the original, but with better production. The new series does feel like these shows we get today in many ways, but only in that we've more fine-tuned the way we want these stories presented to us as a large audience, particularly as adults. It's essentially the childhood wish to have one of your favorite action cartoons just get a more serious treatment without losing what already made it great, and it does get serious. This new series, to really grab our attention, focuses on Magneto inheriting the legacy of Xavier, which actually causes him to work towards a world of tolerance instead of a world where humans and mutants fight each other for supremacy. By the end of the season, the conflict from the humans has grown so much that, spoiler alert, Gambit ends up dying in battle with a Sentinel, and Magneto begins to look a bit appealing to some of the X-Men, particularly Rogue and Alberto, who was basically sold into his death by his mother in order to avoid embarrassment. After a season of trying to find peace with humans, Magneto gives up and destroys their new living Sentinels and promises the end of the age of unmutated man. Now, I'm no expert on X-Men, but with the versions I've seen, Magneto and Xavier's dynamic is always the heart of the greater story. Each of the X-Men has their own crazy cool backstory, many of which were explored in the original series with drama that you just didn't get in a lot of kid shows back then. But Xavier and Magneto kind of embody all of that with a relationship of their own. While both mutants, Magneto is well known for wanting a world where only mutants rule or even live, with Xavier hoping to find a way to maintain balance between the mutants and the humans. But being friends with so much history makes their battles so much more dramatic and traumatic. Every single blow is personal, and the two go from wanting what is best for each other to being at each other's throats when pushed too far. The revival ended up being one of the most intense cartoons I've seen in a long time, getting away with its serious elements without all of that self-parody that so many shows rely on these days, embracing the seriousness of the original and just upping the ante with a more focused and dramatic story that takes everything the show had already worked with and escalates it to a higher level. The season explored the idea that, for either side, tolerance is ultimately extinction, the risk of one side overrunning the other, even if it's the mutants overrunning the humans simply by being the next stage in their evolution. The season ended not just on a cliffhanger, but rather on a setup, with the gang being split into different groups across various eras of time. With their powers, they can easily best the local warriors in battle, but the fun promise will be more so in how these characters try to coexist with these humans before they are eventually returned to their proper time. These humans can benefit from the mutant powers more so than the modern humans, but can also be taken advantage of by men like Magneto, who may want to reshape the future in his image by changing the past. The show is already set for more seasons that will undoubtedly continue to play with these characters in new and interesting ways, and hopefully it leads to other shows getting the same treatment. Teen Titans has perhaps the most vocal cries for a revival and continuation, and like DC tends to do, hopefully they'll copy Marvel and realize that a new season of Teen Titans could drive some traffic to HBO Max, or as they call it these days, just Max. But what do you guys think? Let me know your thoughts on this reboot, favorite characters. Should Deepcut get an xmen? I really just want to dress up as Wolverine, to be honest. Put your ideas in the comments down below, and I'll see you guys next time.